Now, as the internet and the global digital economy expand, it is becoming clear that the benefits of digitalization fall far short of the expectations to create more equitable economic opportunities and societal benefits worldwide.
It doesn't surprise me in the least.
Pardon? Today, please mute your mic. Today, roughly 40% of the world population are left out and do not have access to the internet. So most of those people live in countries of the global south. But an equitable digitalization is not just a question of access. It is also a question of who reaps the digital dividend and who carries the social and ecological burdens that go along with the rapid spread and increasing use of digital technologies. Social challenges manifest, for example, in the exclusion of marginalized groups and in insufficient labor standards in the electronics industries. It encompasses also privacy and security threats. On the other hand, there are severe ecological consequences. Just think of the destruction and the pollution of vast areas of land in countries of the global south that go along with the extraction of raw materials for information and communication technologies. But there are also more ecological implications, such as, for example, the rising greenhouse gas emissions from the production of ICTs, as well as an increasing pile of e-waste. So capturing the value of the global digital economy, on the other hand, is mostly concentrated in only a few number of countries, above all the United States and China, leading to a heavy imbalance with regard to who loses and who gains. Harnessing the digital economy for the many and not just for the few is therefore a major challenge that we are going to discuss today. What are the underlying causes of these imbalances and how can they be overcome? These and many more questions will be tackled in the next roughly 90 minutes, and I'm delighted to welcome 4 distinguished experts who are going to discuss with us and who I would now like to introduce to you. First of all, I'd like to welcome Nikki Liza-Cole, who is a sociologist and visiting researcher in the Science, Technology and Society unit at the Graz University of Technology in Austria. Nikki's research focuses particularly on sustainability challenges in the supply chains of the global electronics industry. Welcome, Nikki. I also welcome Claude Kabemba, who is the Executive Director of the Southern African Resource Watch, which is based in South Africa. Claude is working with this organization for participatory, transparent, and accountable utilization of extractive resources in order to create social and economic benefits, especially for the most marginalized groups. I also welcome Anita Gurumurthy, who is the founding member and executive director of IT4Change. IT4Change is an NGO which is based in Bangalore in India and which is working for a society in which digital technologies contribute to human rights and justice. And Anita leads at ICT4Change the research on emerging topics, such as, for example, platform economy, data and AI governance. And finally, I would like to warmly welcome Sergio Windauer. Sergio is a freelancer and she has a background in industrial engineering for environment and sustainability. She's a civil society activist who is working with various organizations on sustainable digital transformations. And she's committed to show how ICTs can be used to reach the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, Johanna already briefly introduced me. My name is Kirsten Fletcher, and I'm the head of research unit on digitalization at the Institute for Future Studies and Technology Assessment in Berlin. And there my research also focuses on the question on how digital transformations in the global south can become more sustainable. So welcome to all of you, and I'm very looking forward to our discussion. And I'd like to actually start with you, Nikki, and ask you how you became interested in studying the supply chains and the related challenges in the electronic industry.
Thank you, Kerstin. Can everybody hear me okay?
Very well.
Okay. First, thank you to you and to Johanna for organizing this really interesting panel. It's my pleasure to participate, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the other panelists as well. So how did I become interested in studying the electronics industry? I have a background in both consumer sociology and global political economy, and my work had always been focused on the connections between both branding and consumer culture and what goes on behind the scenes to make the products we consume. But I had never paid attention to electronics specifically until 2012, when global news broke of the labor scandal that Apple experienced in the Chinese electronics industry. It was at the beginning of 2012 that suddenly the news was everywhere that the workers producing iPhones and other Apple products were laboring in rather horrific conditions, excessive work hours ranging from 60 to 100 hours a week, unsafe workplace environments, harsh management, and at that time, even a spate of worker suicides that drew quite a lot of critical attention. And I am an Apple user myself and had been for quite some time. And what really struck me, also thinking from a branding and consumer culture standpoint, was the great disjuncture and contradictions between the brand image of Apple and the reality of how the products are made. And what I mean is Apple has become known for sleek, clean design, and also for positioning their products as innovative, progressive, and as pushing the world in new and better directions. And of course, that grates against the reality of horrible worker abuses existing within their supply chain. So that really captured my attention. Personally, it angered me quite a bit. And as a sociologist, it really piqued my interest to understand more so the power of Apple's branding and to develop a richer understanding of what was going on within their supply chain. And what I learned when I started looking into this, first by studying the case of Apple and then by expanding my research into the broader electronics industry, is that there are truly systemic and rather long-term social, environmental, and economic issues across this industry, across the supply chains. So ranging, of course, as panelists and probably many participants know, from the extractive industries for the metals and minerals that are required to produce our devices, all the way through parts production, assembly, etc. Would you like me to speak now in more detail into these, or
yes?
Okay.
Maybe you can give us an example that you found out in your research, which struck you most, or which was most surprising to you.
Sure. So as I said, these are long-term and systemic issues, and what I see are social issues existing in all aspects of the supply chain. So in terms of parts production and assembly, which largely takes place in China and other parts of Southeast Asia, what we see are just really oppressive workplace environments and work conditions. Also highly exploitative wage structures. So often minimum wages are met at a local level, but they might be far removed from what would be considered a living wage. So these wages often keep people in poverty. We see environmental issues across the supply chain, from pollution at sites of assembly and manufacture down to environmental degradation in the extractive industries.
Hello.
We also see community level disruptions, social disruptions in terms of, for example, massive proportions of generations being sucked into urban sectors in China to do this work, leaving behind their elders in rural communities, even their children in rural communities. And we see displacement of communities and local economies at sites of extraction. And so, of course, then there are economic impacts as well. The large brands, for example, Apple and Samsung, and the large manufacturers like Foxconn are reaping quite a lot in terms of profit, but at the same time, there's very little economic return at sites of production or at sites of extraction. There are even perhaps economic penalties for living at sites of extraction where resources are being taken from the community, alternative economies are being knocked out, communities are being displaced, and so people are actually experiencing harms rather than benefits from being associated with or working within these industries that are funneling into the electronics sector. And so for me, one of the most interesting things I've found so far in my research is that these conditions are rather persistent. There have been now a couple of decades of rather focused action from activists, community members, civil society, government actors increasingly so, and even a fair amount of actors within industry pressing to make some changes in terms of social impacts, environmental impacts, and economic equity. Yet we see overall very little change, often minor or symbolic change in lieu of major systemic change. So what's really striking to me is the sort of the persistence of these problems and the great difficulty that seems to exist in fostering any kind of push towards sustainability within this industry.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Systemic issues and systemic challenges is definitely something that we want to tackle, and we are going to talk about this more in detail later on. And you already mentioned that many companies on the outside say that they're doing a lot for sustainability, be it for workers' rights or be it also for when it comes to the question of resources. And therefore, I'd like to direct a question to Claude, because your organization is working on the extractive industry and its hazardous effects in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, but also Zimbabwe. And I'd like to ask you, what do you think of, or what your take is on those kind of voluntary commitments by big companies to use, for example, conflict-free minerals in their products? Is it credible? Is it really working on the ground?
Thank you, Kerstin. And I want to associate myself with an excellent introduction by Nikki, which I want to align with. And as I speak, I also speak in reference to a brilliant introduction that Nikki has just done. I want to, my main argument is that those voluntary mechanisms are necessary, but they're not efficient and they are not adequate. Despite the existence of these mechanisms, there are illegal trading which continues in different countries. There are continuous labor around child labor that continues. All those things that Nikki described persist despite the effort that are being made by government, by companies. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, what is even more concerning, and you'll know that were some of the most strategic minerals. Your treaties, tin, tantalum, tungsten, are extracted in an artisanal manner And despite the presence of the United Nations peacekeeping force, the biggest in the world, the recent expert report suggests that even the United Nations peacekeeping forces are involved in illicit trade of these minerals. It's just to show you how difficult it is to ensure that there is equity in the distribution of benefits from the extraction of these resources. The mechanisms, there are many. You've got mechanisms that are binding and those which are not binding. You have the Dodd-Frank legislation. You have the International Conference of the Great Lakes Region regulations. You have the EU responsible sourcing legislation. You also have the OECD guidelines, due diligence guidelines, which those are critical mechanisms that have been put in place. But beyond those, you also have a multitude of other mechanisms, which include the geo-traceability, the certified trading chain, better sourcing program, all this multitude of certification and mechanism put in place to resolve mostly the problem of conflict and mineral sourcing have not really resolved the problem, which is linked to violation of human rights. And the problem we have with the definition of conflict is that it's mostly focused on hard conflict. When that is visible, most of the things that Nikki have spoken about are also source of conflict, what we can call soft conflict. When you have the displacement of people, when you have water pollution, when you have land polluted, all these things start to create scarcity around food security, around access to clean water, and going against the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, these mechanisms are put in place to ensure that companies using or trading in minerals may have put in place mechanisms of trying to ensure that they know the source of where these minerals are coming from and how these minerals are extracted and in which conditions. By publicly reporting on these risks and on what they have done, companies can show to the consumers, to communities, that they are sourcing these minerals responsibly. That's really the main objectives of these mechanisms. But when you look at the Dodd-Frank, to take up that key one, which I consider as the most progressive, it has a lot of weaknesses, despite the fact that it afforded a lot of change in legislation in countries, but also by companies taking leading and progressive steps to ensure that they do source responsibly. The weaknesses which are linked to all of these mechanisms will include, for example, what I've spoken earlier on, the limitation of the definition of conflict. The system of managing these certification mechanisms is quite expensive. Because it's expensive, companies do not want to invest very much in these certification mechanisms, especially upstream suppliers. They cut corners due to their because the government that put those legislation in place, you take the United States, has got no capacity to monitor the source of those minerals. Every government, we've realized that they don't have the capacity, they've got capacity constraints and ineffectiveness in their traceability service provider. Mm-hmm. And that it's a major, major problem. Then another problem that we've seen is the extent to which downstream companies actually adhere to these requirements. And I think it's linked to what Nikki spoke about, the brand image of these companies. Most of the time, what they do is to often to secure marketing gains. It's a PR exercise. But when you follow very closely, you understand that most of the extraction of these minerals take place in remote areas, mm-hmm. where there is no infrastructure, accessibility is very difficult, and most of the auditing companies that have been put in place do not have the capacity and the willingness to go to where these minerals are being extracted.
So Claude, if I may interrupt you at this point, because you already mentioned so many interesting points, which I would like to take up in the discussion later on, but also hand to other panelists. So if I clearly understood you, Claude, it is not the issue that there is not enough regulations and mechanisms in place, but that there are still actually loopholes and a lot of invisibility as well. That many of the challenges are not visible also to the public, despite mechanisms in place that should provide transparency. Is that one of the core issues?
Yes, it's a core issue, but it's also the inclusion mm-hmm. of local people in the monitoring system.
Okay.
You cannot monitor the monitoring has to be permanent, continuous, mm-hmm. because these resources are extracted on a continuous basis. Okay. Now, you cannot be an auditing firm that comes in once in 6 months or once in 8 mm-hmm. months. You need to build a body of monitoring system that is efficient, that is present on a continual basis. Mm-hmm. And what we've realized is that while there are gaps in these guidelines, they don't also have the capacity for a continuous monitoring and ensuring, but also the identification of culprit has not been has not been there, and the sanctions, we have not seen them, despite the fact that we know that pollution continues, illicit trade continues, conflict continues, but minerals continue to get out of those countries.
Okay, thank you very much. And you already raised a very important issue, which is the issue of inclusion, but also regulation. And one of the sectors in the digital economy, which to me always seems very little regulated, is actually the platform economy sector. And I know that you, Anita, has been working extensively also on the question of how gig workers work in this platform economy sectors and the kind of challenges they are facing. So could you tell us a little bit more about the challenges people and workers face in the platform economy, especially when they come from the margins? Oh, you're muted. There you go.
Okay. Thanks so much. It has been a very instructive discussion, even if very depressing, because, you know, this is not just an academic thought. I think that what is at stake is really, really huge. And it's about justice, it's about local economies, and it's really about the future of labor rights. The meaning of gig historically is a job usually done for a specified time. Going back, in the olden days, especially in entertainment. So Understood this way, the gig is supposed to be a way of making your livelihood. It's not labor that is coercive. It's free labor, free as in freedom, you know. But the informality of present day gig work translates into the extraction of labor power and transfer of workers' data into the algorithmic optimization process in the capitalist digital economy. So what do I mean by this? Digitalization is built on and it reinforces racialized gender and class hierarchies and perpetuates a race to the bottom in a global market. So it's actually constructed globally, and it's part of a new international division of labor that builds on the old international division of labor. So let's take the case of the global market for crowd work in the first instance. So as a data worker in South Africa put it, you go apply for a job and somebody else will come and apply for lesser, and they are the people from the Philippines and India. So this is actually a race to the bottom where you are going to really be squeezed. Online outsourcing is going to get a fillip in the post-COVID platform economy, but what we're going to see is fewer digital jobs than there are people able and willing to do them. So in a rapidly growing global data market, outsourcing is bound to accelerate labor arbitrage. Let's now consider on-demand or platform-mediated work in the services sector in the global south. What platforms do is they reflect and reify the same gender-based occupational segmentation. You see women workers far more prevalent in on-demand platforms such as cleaning or care work, whereas sectors such as ride-hailing, food delivery, etc., are heavily dominated by male workers. The continuing lack of access and know-how to operate gadgets or to be digitally fluent also costs women very, very heavily. In countries such as the Philippines, for instance, high connectivity rates create imperfect platform models in domestic work. The platformized domestic work economy is not truly disintermediated at all, and it doesn't offer, real choice or agentic access to the job market. Therefore, women end up continuing to face exploitative local contracting systems. In countries like mine, what the pandemic has highlighted is that gig workers considered as independent contractors are not entitled to anything. No compensation, no healthcare benefits, no sick pay. The lack of social protections and safety nets for platform workers, mainly coming from the lack of legal definition. They really are not protected by laws at all, and legacy legislation simply leaves them out or gives them some kind of intermediary status, means that people are still showing up to work in the midst of the pandemic, but without any cover or any security. And invariably, all the biggest platforms, even in the US, have passed on the externalities of having to offer workers some basic minimal protection to governments. They have asked governments to provide the financial support to their workers. In India, actually, we found that delivery workers were in the front lines of the crisis, because we know that e-commerce was declared in most countries as an essential service. But invariably, what tended to take center stage was this kind of assuaging of consumers' anxieties. So all the companies had to promise hygiene and sanitation standards, which basically translates into surveillance of workers. In the industry already, platform workers are heavily surveilled. We know that about Uber drivers. We know that about Lyft drivers. Today, all these workers in restaurants, who are doing the deliveries are subject to routine temperature checks, and they have to compulsorily come on board all the national apps, the health surveillance or disease surveillance apps. And this has completely eroded their fundamental rights. And, there's hardly any public outrage at all. Meanwhile, there's an interesting story. In India, all of this has led to a certain kind of a disaster capitalism. You actually see many e-commerce companies coming together, foreign investments. Amazon is partnering with local e-commerce. Facebook has invested in a local e-commerce company that also belongs to the largest giant telecommunications company in India. So you see these perverse confluences because all of them want to come together to offer to the last mile mom and pop stores a new lease of life. They're telling the mom and pop stores, come along and join the supply chain, and we will make sure that you can have on WhatsApp a shop front. You know, we will enable you to have some business in these depressing times. But all of this is only about monopolistic consolidation and a co-option of local stores. We know very well that local pockets of capital accumulation, vibrancy of the local economy, skills and capacities of local entrepreneurs, all of this is about what we call development. And once you have these companies come in and de-skill the labor, you know, what you're going to actually have is this kind of a homogenized platform economy, which is consolidating across all the verticals. Labor's relationship also has to be understood in relation to many other things. And this is the last point I want to make about workers, which is very significant to agriculture. What we actually see is smallholder peasants in Asia are really squeezed. You know, we have Alibaba, and Alibaba recently, a few years ago, launched its ET agricultural brain, which is a cloud, which is its cloud platform, and it onboarded everybody, small farmers, etc., and said, look, you know, we don't know what to do with pigs, but farmers know it best. But what we can do is offer you the insights of pig rearing, you know. Now, what this suggests is that smart agriculture, smart automation in agriculture, AI-led supply chains in agriculture is going to completely displace farmers, and they have to somehow, you know, succumb and join these supply chains, lose their autonomy, or they will completely be rendered irrelevant in the kinds of new food chains that we are going to see in the future. This is true for Africa also. Of course, you know, there are very many ways policies can fix this, but, you know, that's something that we have to think about. And perhaps I will leave it here for you to pick up on the solutions that we could think about collectively.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to very much do this, and thanks to the three of you, Anita, Nikki, and Claude, for mapping out those very complex and interlinked challenges that we see in the digital economy, ranging from resource extraction to the conditions of work in the production sites of ICTs, up to the platform economy and the gig workers there. And Anita, you already mentioned that we also need solutions, and therefore I'd like to to address a question to Sadia and ask you from a civil society perspective, from a Northern civil society perspective, what more could actually be done than just raising awareness and providing transparency and being a conscious consumer to shift the balance more in favor of the marginalized people in the digital economy.
Thank you. My sound is good?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect, thank you. First of all, we have to define which areas digitization affects us and how. For example, the Agenda 2030 does not explicitly mention how digitization in form of infrastructure or tools development is to be organized. We must examine the following remarks with regard to all individual SDGs and their relationships to each other. We have to agree on what we understand by equity and sustainability, especially translated to the digital economy. This means having an equal basis in understanding these terms and their meanings. We should also follow our own already existing guidelines, for example, with the human rights. Then we should translate it to digital tool development and implement the guidelines to the Agenda 2030 in full. I think in the global north, we are at the very beginning of raising awareness to this topic. And when we speak about the broad public, we see it in a really official way that we are not able to decide in the sense of an equity or sustainable digitization. For that, an open and unsparing examination of the status quo should be carried out. What are the remaining hurdles? What types of power relations will remain key influencing factors? The internet is often described as an idealized place that should be accessible for everyone, regardless of origin, language, and status or gender. This is a really good vision, but the reality looks very different. In Europe, for example, as in other places in the world, access is not open or affordable for everyone. That has become very clear to us in the recent months. While COVID-19 started, and for example, in German schools, universities, and training centers, they had to overcome their lack of IT infrastructure. Students were left behind. because family access to the internet is still not available everywhere. So not even in so-called rich countries. In addition, a system has been created in which data collection in IT systems for a few powerful economic entities ensures their existence. They have not enough incentives and therefore no interest in changing anything in the user experience that would make, for example, hate speech more difficult. So we currently exclude a large number of people by designing software and hardware. But this is not our goal if we take our own words seriously. In order to meet these hurdles, the following aspects should challenge us as makers and consumers in the global north again and again, especially when we are interested in governmental transparency, civil organized participation and welfare. The aspect of common willingness, that means the will to create fair and sustainable digitization for everyone. This is a basic requirement. Without this agreement and action, we will continue to produce racist or sexist software or force people into anonymity to avoid, for example, harassment, hate speech, doxing, persecution, etc. We have to be clear about these opponent developments when we design or order technical solutions. Then we have the aspect of common ground. We should working out common ground in order to learn from each other more and more. For example, ICT4 exchange could be a keyword in this place. The aspect of awareness and privileges is very interesting as well. Who actually has the opportunity to play an essential and therefore powerful role in digitization? How and to whom skills are taught? Who is asked or who's asked for design specifications? So who are the decision makers? Who are the all over again the same target groups? Here I expect the development towards more independence for every individual involved. This can be achieved by granting rights as the self-evident right to participate and an opening towards more must express themselves in the designs of software. When I say about designs, I mean planning, implementation, testing, and using. Here I speak about users, developers, or decision makers. We need a bias-sensitive development of the digital economy and the flexibility where necessary and a hard line in areas that are too sensitive to be subordinated to the opinion of a majority society. This all should be part of our education. No matter if we speak about the education of kids, students, or workers, leave no one behind should be our slogan. The aspect of funding. When we talk about independent software, infrastructures, and development in digitalization, we have to talk about the funding. We heard a lot in this panel about this, and I will emphasize this as well. So the whole idea must be supported by robust funding that is detached from the typical market situation within the dogma of unlimited growth, and also from governments and their crisis, resilient in other words. And the last aspect, I think it's very interesting, is tech itself. How can a sustainable design of ICT in our sense look like? To do this, we have to look at not only at the ethical principles in companies, educational institutions, and government-driven software developments, but also at the value chain already mentioned and its respective effects. It's very important to the global north to ask itself and make it clear as a hard boundary what our consumption has in store for spillovers to other regions, for example. And with all this, we have to ask ourselves again and again, what kind of image of humanity do we have here? Who benefits and who loses? If we can find all this within ourselves, we will be able to shape digitization in our own sense. We will have informed people who will stand up for their rights, and thus a strong civil society that can demand transparency. So we need clear frameworks that reflect justice, equality, and sustainability equally, frameworks that are aware that we have to learn to avoid conflicts of interests, These frameworks must therefore also be designed to be adaptable, but also robust enough. We will have to be more open to this, real diversity, real evaluation of our own institutional colonialism, racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, fascism, capitalism, and ableism. We must give up power. We can do this, among other things, by promoting teaching and demanding open data, open source, and open hardware. So far from my side.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for the statement and for those many options you've also pointed out where we can actually work together on turning the digital economy and the electronics industry into a more sustainable industry. I'm also glad you raised the issue of power relations and also of taking the values that we're stressing so often, be it the human rights, be it sustainabilities, to take them more seriously. And I've already seen in the comments questions or remarks about how important this is, but also how long it takes to implement them and to really change something in the industry. And I know that you, Nikki, you work on those questions. So could you tell us a little bit more why you think that all those challenges that we've now extensively discussed are so persistent?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much to all the panelists for sharing your perspectives. I'm learning a lot and I really appreciate it. So in responding to your question, I also want to second a lot of what Claude said, especially in terms of blind spots within regulatory mechanisms. The Dodd-Frank Act, for example, which seeks to regulate the use of conflict minerals. It also strikes me that the definition of conflict is incredibly narrow and leaves most forms out of the equation. And Claude mentioned also the problematic issues with auditing. And this is something that I'd like to speak to more in terms of why these problems persist. So within the electronics industry, there has developed a culture of corporate social responsibility as the sort of mode and mechanisms through which regulation and change are supposed to take place. And these are based on, as Claude pointed out, sort of periodic audits rather than continuous auditing driven by local participants. I have found through, in particular, a study of Apple suppliers, and this can be very much generalized to the industry, that the CSR model is broken. It doesn't work. And I'm speaking specifically to supplier responsibility codes of conduct within China, and to how the data that Apple publishes, how this compares to reports coming from activists, journalists, and NGOs. And I found by comparing known Apple suppliers over nearly 2 decades to these critical reports that despite the efforts that Apple claims to make, and in particular in contradiction to their code, which is that they either work with a problematic supplier to improve conditions, and if that fails, they cut ties with that supplier. Well, what the research shows is that actually the same suppliers are a part of their supply chain year after year, and we see long-term recurring problems rather than solutions. And so, for example, I looked at about 38 factory sites over that were present within the Apple supply chain over nearly 2 decades, and taking each site for years violations were noted as a case. I had a total of 76 cases, and across these, I saw recurring excessive work hours amongst 78% of cases. So that means that suppliers are not meeting the local guidelines and laws for what work hours are supposed to be, and they're exceeding Apple's code of conduct. Similarly, we saw long-term excessive violations in health and safety, harsh management, low wages, injury on the job, unpaid wages, and severe exhaustion, which leads to significant mental illness amongst workers. So rather than seeing audits foster change, we see that, in fact, you could say audits are used as a tool to cover up what's actually going on. And in some cases, conditions have worsened over time despite audits taking place. So for example, an iPhone supplier from 2015 to 2016, Pegatron, it was found by activist groups that at-home wages were declining, even though conditions were said to be improving within this facility, because minimum wage increases were offset by cuts to welfare payments. So workers had a net loss, even though it was positioned as a gain. We saw similar things happen at Foxconn in the aftermath of the 2012 scandal. There were lots of publicized changes that were said to be positive at Foxconn, but while wages were raised, so too were production quotas. So workers were expected to work more for that tiny bit of additional money they received. So to me, from a bigger picture perspective, this shows that industry-driven regulation is not working. And what that speaks to, I think, is a need for real effective regulation driven by governments. And of course, this is very difficult in a capitalist context, in a system of global capitalism, where governments are pitted against each other to offer the best deal in terms of low tax rates, loose regulations, and low wages to companies. So as Anita pointed out, there's a race to the bottom in all aspects of industry and work life, and even community experience and quality of life, driven by the profit motives of actors operating on the global capitalist stage. So what I think is really critical is that we need a system of governance that matches the global system of production and distribution and financial flows that we actually have. And we don't have that right now. We have a fragmented system that is not working effectively. And a further point I'd like to make in response to something Claude said about the need for local driven monitoring, I couldn't agree more. And there actually is an effort by an NGO that I do some work with called Electronics Watch, where they are using what they call worker-driven monitoring to improve the system of monitoring within electronics producers. And what that means is that the goals or the framework of what should be monitored and the goals for the outcomes of the monitoring should be determined in large part by what serves the workers. And of course, this framework of this way of thinking about auditing could be applied to environmental outcomes. And we could also apply it to the way we think about economic distribution across global value chains. Again, as you said, Kerstin, one of the bigger issues is who benefits and who loses. And so, yeah, I think that that's a real a possibility for progress, is to bring workers and impacted community members into defining a process of regulation and to having them help to execute it so that it truly is serving their needs and not just the needs of the businesses as it is in the current system.
Thank you very much, Nikki, also for those very tangible findings and insights in your empirical research that you did. And also thank you for taking this whole question of regulation more to the global level. You said, I wrote it down, industry-driven regulation is not working. And we actually have a process on the international level, which appears to me very industry-driven, or at least oriented towards, very much towards the the interests of the digital economy players, the large ones. And this is the process of drafting or developing a regulation for the global e-commerce. And I know that you, Anita, has been working on the question of international trade, especially linked to the emerging digital economy. So could you tell us a little bit more about what you think, which role international trade agreements play in this area, and where we are heading now actually with this topic?
Yeah, thank you. I was just unmuting. You know, at the WTO, with respect to e-commerce, for the past few years, I think that most of us know that there has been a face-off between the United States and its allies on one side and developing countries, many developing countries like India and the African bloc on the other. This has broadly been over a set of issues. You know, we will come to that briefly. But meanwhile, there are about 76 countries that have joined a plurilateral process, and this includes very big economies. It also includes both the US, Australia, and developing countries both from Africa and Asia. And the efforts of this group to proceed with discussions on e-commerce continues in the middle of the pandemic. So the whole idea is like a propaganda initiative. There are webinars that are organized on data policies, trade policies, digital payment services. How do you include MSMEs, you know, marginal small and medium enterprises? What kinds of digital tools can be given to small businesses, etc. And the whole effort is to enlist the cooperation of, you know, to persuade more developing countries to sign on, you know. One key issue for developing countries is the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. So this goes back to several years in the GATS, and the whole idea was nobody even thought that all services, you know, would turn digital someday, you know. But today, developing countries have started understanding the implications of this moratorium. In 2017, 86 out of 95 developing countries were net importers of digital services. So a permanent moratorium would imply that you simply cannot regulate the imports, you can't levy tariffs. And what this really means is, obviously this is what the US wants, but invariably, you need two things as an economy in the digital age. You need data, you need software, and both are electronically transmitted. Of course, there's also 3D printing, which is expected to steadily dislodge physical goods in global trade. So developing countries have no choice. They must import the raw material they need for 3D printing, and that they have to do from the US because the US is the largest producer. And then of course, a distant second is China and some other countries. With a permanent moratorium, there will be a huge revenue loss for developing countries, and post the pandemic, you know, when the world is going into a global recession, this is not good news at all. But the issue of e-commerce or digital trade is not just about customs duties. You know, we need to understand that you know, the stories of extractivism, you know, they only get like into a murkier plot these days. It's not just the extractivism of minerals. It's not just the kind of materialities, you know, we are talking about that previous speakers, Nikki and Claude, have pointed to so eloquently. What it is also is about data extractivism. We need to understand that trade negotiations are increasingly linked to the digital economy in this sense that platform lead firms controlling data value chains dominate global business landscapes today, and they capture a lion's share of the market capitalization. So the top 10 companies of the world are digital companies. So a lot is at stake here. And one important recent development is that the United States has pulled out of OECD negotiations, you know, talking about, you know, these frameworks and regulations and self-regulation and certification standards. A very, very important attempt by OECD countries to sit at the table and thrash out digital tax was completely scuttled because 6 days ago, the US said that it's going to withdraw from these negotiations, and it has also threatened the EU that it will retaliate with some kinds of, you know, trade restrictions if EU moves ahead with plans and starts taxing American companies. A number of European countries were hoping to impose taxes, and France has said that they are not going to listen to the US. So it remains to be seen how this turf war between the big tech giants, and the US obviously is backing them, the rest of the world, and of course China with its interests in African markets, how it's all going to pan out. The last and most crucial aspect, of course, there are many others, and investments and financing for development are very important frontier issues because they will become very significant in the post-COVID era. But the crucial aspect in the trade arena is also about cross-border data flows. The dreams of the US tech giants has resulted in a strong push for a laissez-faire data governance regime. So it's like a Wild West, finders, keepers. I had first mover advantage. I landed in a market, it may be social media, it may be search, it may be one of those, e-commerce, but because I landed there first, I get to keep the wares. I get to keep the data and I get to reap the intelligence from there. So today, what you actually see is in the RCEP, for instance, the Asian Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, there's greater flexibility for controls on data flows, and domestic economies have a better leeway to control localization and others, because without harnessing data, no economy is going to be able to develop. Mm-hmm. But I want to come to a last point. Do I have 30 seconds? Can I go?
30, 20.
Okay, 20. This is the example of the UK and the NHS data, the health data that the NHS actually has. The Secretary of State for International Trade in the UK has been saying, you know what, we'll never put NHS at the table. It can never get privatized. But she makes no mention of NHS data because all of it is now in Amazon's hands. And Alexa is apparently making the job of doctors and nurses and pharmacists easy by helping consumers with advice. So all of this is positioned as a win-win situation, which it is not. It is simply an abuse and extraction of the public data commons. So I'll leave it there and we'll come and talk about solutions if there's time.
Thank you very much. And I want to hand over the question of data and solutions right to Satya and ask you, what do you think, could open data be actually a solution to those challenges that Anita just outlined?
I think so, yes. I think it's a big opportunity to take open data, open source, and open hardware technologies very seriously. But these are three big fields. I will reduce my speech here. I don't go to the technical insights because I think there are a lot of other people who know it better. But what I can say is free and open source software, in short, FOSS, and open hardware are essential elements in sustainable development, as we heard. After the Snowden leaks, for example, a lot of money was put into open infrastructures because people like activists want and need it. Worldwide, decentralized open source technologies are used in the activist scenes, for example. This was also necessary because of ongoing digitization makes it easier for the powerful ones to silence the disturbing ones. The raising public and not public observation is one factor here. The importance of secure communication channels has taken on a prominent role in the digitally networked. Human rights activists all over the world depend on them. So it is from this idea of exchange alone that FOSS is an important block towards sustainable development. When we talk about FOSS and governments, we can repeat public money, public vote, period. And when we talk about open technologies or data, the first thing I have to say briefly is that we are talking about opening public data, but not private data. This helps us to gain a common overview of, for example, government behavior, decision-making. With the amount of data we have, we can make our own decisions. Data literacy is therefore an essential contribution to the critical discussion, and often also a means of creating facts that emerge in civil society and not just in the realm of governments. Open hardware also has many dimensions. It can radically change the given positions of power within the world of consumption and it is already doing so. I was part of a group in Berlin, in Brandenburg, in the last few months that worked decentral to produce face shields in various makerspaces to give them out for free of charge to medical personnel. Then market mechanism couldn't work really fair. This would not have been possible without the willingness to share knowledge, to disclose, and to optimize them jointly. Those community projects are existing all over the world. Digital networking and access takes place in these areas as well. But when we look at funding, we realize that getting beyond the point of idealism. The issue great, the success of secure communication, for example, is nobody wants to pay for it at the moment. In the USA, the Open Technology Fund is currently under attack, and indeed by the government. It is to be feared that money that has previously put into FOSS and was a secure source of funding money for a lot of projects, products, etc., will only be put into commercial deals with new regulations, which then often means closed source. As a result, access to these technologies will no longer be possible for many people. The existing products which use like end-to-end encryption, communication application like Signal or Tor will have to look for new money, as secure planning and maintenance will be more difficult. And why? Because the idea of generating profits is in the DNA of many considerations. So this Open Technology Fund is a good example of the oversleeping of opportunities. Europe has not created such a source of financing. Good projects will run into financial difficulties because they are more or less a reliable source in the past. That shouldn't happen to us. It must be possible to make resilience fail safe. New financing opportunities like via foundations or something could be a solution. Here I come back to this we mentioned earlier, which we should teach as skills in schools, universities, and in our own lifelong learning. Informed citizens are sensitized, and resistance to certain foundations to be established would thus be more and more excluded. In this respect, awareness, funding, design framework of FOSS, open data, and open hardware play a key role in this digital transformation.
Thank you very much. So there are actually options, as you have pointed out, and they need to be captured. And I'd like to end our round of questions on this issue of capturing the options and the opportunities which are out there. And I would like to direct the question to Claude. What do you think can actually African governments do to capture those options and those opportunities? And I particularly think of the case of Rwanda, who has become a front runner when it comes to digitalization in very short time, which is now producing an own smartphone actually. Could this be a role model, or what do you think? Oh, you're muted. There you go.
I was saying that's a big question. I think my predecessors, Nikki, Anita, and Sadia, have raised important issues, which I think I need to elaborate on before I respond to that important question.
Very briefly, because we also want to open for
I'll be very quickly. I think the world, they've demonstrated that there is a structural problem with the global trade regime, which we need to deal with. I think that regime, which is driven by the race to the bottom, has continued to sustain the center-periphery relations, where the periphery supplies raw materials and the center uses them and modernize their lives. But what we've also realized is that digitalization has provided opportunities to many parts of the world, but is the arrangement, is the nature of the structure of the world system that keeps one part behind, and the difficulty and deliberate decision to pull others with And that poses a bigger problem. So the benefits of it continues to be defined by power relations. And that power is putting constraints on the ability of a continent like Africa, because the idea and the expectation was that Africa is going to leapfrog quite faster to join the industrialized world through digitalization. But we are seeing that access to data, open data, is good to talk about it, but in reality it does not happen. There is a lot of secrecy around data, transparency, accountability, equity, very good values. But when you dig down in these companies, very difficult to be as transparent as expected. So we are seeing Africa lying behind. Instead of speeding up inclusion, digitalization is in fact leaving behind a very big mass of people. And your question, Catherine, that we are seeing a pot of positive reaction from the African continent. And you've alluded to Rwanda. Rwanda is a very good case where Rwanda is taking initiatives to start assemble some of this technology within Rwanda. I think it's an important element to show that it's possible even for African countries to leapfrog, but you need a leadership, a leader that can take decisions despite the difficulties in the global system. But you should not, for example, compare Rwanda to the Democratic Republic of Congo. These are two different countries. I'll give you an example. The Democratic Republic of Congo possesses some of all these strategic minerals that we need for our phone, for our computers, in abundance. But is also a space where there is competition between the superpowers to control that country. And one of the solutions we are proposing for Africa, for example, is that we need to do like what Rwanda is doing, but in this way, we should start adding value to our minerals so that we export finished good. But when Africa start to do that, it have an impact on Western economy, has an impact on Western employment. And the question is that is the West prepared to let Africa own and control its resources? And that's where power becomes in, because all the conflict you see in the Democratic Republic of Congo are not conflict made by Congolese themselves, are conflict of interest, organized interest between different powers to ensure that control and so on. That's why you'll see, even in terms of politics, at the national level, in terms of elections and so on, they're all controlled in terms of these strategic countries with important, abundant resources, so that they are not lost from their control. Now, the question is, Kerstin, is the Western world, is China, is Russia prepared to give space for Africa to own, control, and add value to its resources? That's the first one. I think what I'm proposing, that Africa needs to be given space to be helped to start adding value to these minerals, because the issue raised by Nikki of that the problem of digitalization, that it created not just problem of labor, of environmental things, there are issues of real benefits in terms of taxation. When you look at the taxation regime, there is no way African countries could really benefit to the maximum from their minerals or from this trade, because the negotiation around tax regime is always skewed on the other side. That one. Secondly, I think there is need for Africa to introduce reform, to create entrepreneurial space for new infrastructure. What Rwanda is doing is to create an infrastructure. It's a beginning which needs to be enhanced, but we need to see more and more of that space where you start to create that infrastructure. And Africa possesses one of the biggest markets where Africa can trade within itself. Africa has just put up the free trade arena, and that free trade area need product for it to survive. So the encouragement is that we need to see more African producing some of these products to be traded within the African continent, because it's a big market. We are seeing an increasing middle class in Africa that can also consume this. But the fact that we are in the center-periphery relations, where we export raw material and we import manufactured good, that skewed relations continue to undermine African development. So my take, I think there are two levels, at the country level, but there is also a continental level, because African states are just so small to be able to challenge in negotiations powerful China. That's why we need at the level of the African Union to have an African strategy for digitalization and industrialization, which will be then spread down to regional organization and to country level. So that harmonization of policies, harmonization of infrastructure could enhance the power of the African continent to be capable to negotiate, to be capable to attract investment. Because here, technology exists, skills exist around the world. It's just the ability of African to attract that skills, to come to the African continent and pay that skill what it needs to be to accept to move to the African continent, which has got potential and a lot of benefits. So I think we have those levels of intervention. I think there is also a problem of really our research institutions, which needs to be capacitated enough. I think we are still struggling in a lot of our countries in terms of research, financing research in this area. And that also speaks to the kind of leadership we still have to build our states. Look, I think I'm raising more problems than giving solution. The problem of state capacity to be able to provide financing in these areas is quite weak. But I think what we've seen with the example of Rwanda, with Ethiopia, with Ghana, certainly South Africa, a little bit more advanced, and Egypt, there is a possibility for a much regional, continental approach to the issue of digitalization and industrialization.
Thank you very much, Claude. And thank you also for actually raising those problems that we haven't tackled yet, also because time is of course short to discuss such a complex issue. But I'd like to use the last 15 minutes of our panel to also answer some of the questions from the panelists. And so all of you in the audience, I'd warmly like to invite you to post your questions now in the chat of our Zoom meeting. And I've picked out a question which was already posed earlier, I think quite at the beginning of our panel discussion, which I think was directed to Nikki. The question came up if there is a way to actually force companies to be more transparent. Very short answer, Nikki. Do you see an option to make companies forcefully more transparent?
The short answer would be yes. I believe the responsibility would lie with the governments where corporations are homed, to enforce transparency regulations. At the moment, there are some sort of voluntary regulations, but lacking in transparency? The more complicated answer is that this is difficult because, as we know, most global corporations do not produce their goods. They are produced in the context of global supply chains that involve multitude of firms. So there is the question from a legal standpoint of whether Apple or Samsung is truly responsible to disclose the transparency of their global supply chains when it's not even their operations. Now, from a power dynamic standpoint, of course, we see that these large brands are the ones dictating what happens in these supply chains, what gets produced using what materials. But legally speaking, they're not actually responsible in the way we understand these things right now. So there would need to be significant changes into how we frame responsibility, I think, for global corporations to take on that level of transparency.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Would anybody else like to answer to this question?
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I'll tend to agree with Nikki's first short answer that it's possible, but it has to depend on the national state, on the country, the government. I think it's about what we've seen more put forward is the regime of constraint. These voluntary regimes, mechanisms that are propelled from every corner of the world, but which cannot be enforced. And we neglect what I'll call the regime of responsibility. It's the responsibility of the state, anywhere in the world, to put in place legislation on what it wants to do and how it wants to regulate. And if we reinforce that regime, it's much easier to enforce transparency and accountability first at the country level. And I think for me, that is specifically in the context of the African continent, is that we tend to see that the voluntary regimes start to take preeminence over national legislations, and the inability of states to enforce their own laws, and that creates that problem of lack of transparency. But equally, we have complex and sophisticated companies that can hide in different mechanisms, a lot of data, a lot of flows of finances, but also which are capable to defend themselves in the court of law and win quite easily, even when they've messed up on environment and human rights.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. There was another question coming in through the chat. I'm not totally sure how to read this, but the question says that in Germany we're trying to publicize the concept of democracy by design. And the question is whether you are familiar with this concept, democracy by design. I assume it looks in the direction of data governance, for example, of governing digital systems. So does any one of you is familiar with this concept or thinks this could be a good idea to integrate democracy or also other values into data governance, digital governance? What is your take on it?
I could come in with a short reply. Yes, I think this has been talked about in the context of governance of cities. The examples of Amsterdam and Barcelona are oftentimes, very important cases that are flagged as, fluid democracies, which are able to come together where people are able to vote and they're able to vote on the go. And there's a stake that the communities have in the ways in which the entire commons of information and data are governed. I think an important thing is, if you read, I recently read an interview of Francesca Braia, who's been the architect of that entire data design. And she says that, for a very long time, we've been looking at antitrust and anti-competitive regulation, so you would really want to break up big tech because big tech is going away with the data. But there's another very important thing you need to do. You need to actually say that the economy that is run is very important to the democracy. So in some sense, the economic democracy of citizens counts a lot, and therefore you might have to control the data power of big tech corporations and have them contribute in the public interest mandatorily to the data pool that governs the city. So instead of voluntary data sharing, you will have to in the public interest. For instance, if private companies are collecting data during the pandemic through apps, you will have to say, in the interest of public health, please put that back into the data pool of the city. So part of the solution lies in bringing about innovations in data regulation, both because data is the backbone of civil rights and is the backbone of economic sovereignty.
Thank you very much. I have a question directly to this from my side. Are there any concrete examples, for example, in India, where you see those kind of principles already implemented on the ground?
I think these are early times, but I think we're going to see a lot of these changes. For instance, in India, you know, as we speak, the government is considering a strong policy on non-personal data. And the same is true for the European Union, you know, because just the last month in its immediately after the road to recovery, you know, the EU has scrambled and put together a, you know, series of papers on AI and very explicitly declared, and you know, the GIX, the cloud, you know, the European cloud for European business, you know, it's like to reduce technological dependence, and therefore the public initiatives that create a space for artificial intelligence, digital intelligence to be internalized in the economy are very important. In India, we have the example of the government-run marketplace, e-marketplace, you know, for agricultural produce. That is a public initiative. It's like a public digital infrastructure. So what you really need is digital public goods in the form of cloud infrastructure, platform infrastructure, which can then enable smaller businesses and smaller economic actors to seize these resources better.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We have another comment maybe from one of the participants who rightly points out that we didn't include a company representative and maybe a representative of a company or an organization which already makes serious efforts in our discussion. And this is true. I think there would be a lot of further stakeholders and experts that we would have very much liked to include in the discussion, and definitely exchanging with companies also on their efforts is a very important issue. So I'd like to take up this issue or this topic raised about serious efforts and maybe play it to you, Sadia. How do you see the efforts of companies made, serious efforts made? Have you experiences from your work as a civil society activist with companies? What is your impression? Is this topic gaining more and more traction also within businesses?
Yeah, it's always a question of money and motivation. And, in the end, it's also a question of what could it be done for my image as a company. So this is really difficult to address the companies from our perspective in general. Without having enough ideas how we could finance all this ideas. I was an energy auditor for private companies, industry companies in the last years. And I implemented energy, so it was more energy efficient production lanes, or the buildings should be energy efficient. This is why I speak so much about this base of knowledge that we should have, because the main task that I had as the person who implemented the management system was who speaks with who. So everyone in these companies didn't know what the others do and have to find a base, and there was in this because on one hand didn't know what the others did, and it was like an opposite to each other. But when we listen to each other, then we know, okay, this is your mission, this is my motivation. Very clear that we crash in a point. And this is one of the main points for this big companies, for example, which are the most consumers of energy and emitters of, for example, that they don't have the movement possibilities in their areas. So go back to us as the employees. We are the persons who could say, okay, I want to have a workplace where we are more sustainable, more, because then we grow up in this. And we could have it for our own ideas as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Nikki, you also worked on companies. What would be your best advice for companies that want to take it serious and make the ICT sector more sustainable?
My advice would be to not be afraid of partnering with civil society and to put the experiences and perspectives of workers and impacted communities front and center as a part of their strategy. To that end, I do want to highlight the case of Fairphone, which is a social enterprise based in Amsterdam, and not to sort of cheerlead for them, but to point them out as an example of how a company can operate with a different approach and with different goals to what is found typically within the electronic sector. So I encourage anyone who's interested to learn more about what could a company do to help foster sustainability, to take a look at the initiatives Fairphone is working on. And also, I would say that looking at their efforts, and in some cases, initiatives that haven't worked out so well, it really helps to pinpoint the barriers that companies come up against when they do want to push for sustainability within this industry.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for pointing out this really excellent example of a company that does make a serious effort at the end of our discussion, which, as Anita mentioned in between, has at times been quite depressing, actually, because the challenges that we see in the digital economy and in the electronics industry are really huge, and they need to be tackled on various levels in various countries and by various actors. I thank you all, especially the panelists, Nikki, Satya, Anita, and Claude, for mapping out those challenges, for providing us with insights and with a lot of food for thought. And I hope that this panel has only been the start to discussing the question of equity with regard to the global digitalization. And I hope to see you all soon again, maybe in a panel, maybe otherwise, hopefully at some point, also in the real world and not just virtually. I hope that it was an interesting discussion for our audience. Thank you so much for your questions as well, and keep in touch and keep discussing this important topic of digitalization and equity. Thank you.